Hello, I'm Donal Macaulay and welcome to this BMJ Leader Conversation. Today we're in London and I'm talking to Ajit Abraham. Now, you have reached the very pinnacle of your profession, but I'd really like to take it to the very start. What interested you in medicine to begin with?
So growing up as a young boy in India, my aunt was my inspiration. She was the first female general surgeon in the southern state of Kerala in 1959, believe it or not. I had the privilege of joining her in theatre when I was just doing my A-levels. So I got to attend an operation, nearly made a fool of myself by reaching down to pick up something that had fallen off the sterile trolley, but then was held back. And the whole drama of witnessing a live operation and seeing her fix someone and make them better was something that excited me immensely. And that, I think, was the trigger for wanting to become a surgeon, particularly. So even when I entered medical school, I felt that was the calling for me, even when I was doing dissections in the anatomy hall. So that's what drew me to surgery. I just wanted to make a difference, wanted to be helpful, and I love fixing things, and I thought I'd be good at it.
Wow, that's incredibly inspiring. I mean, she was really ahead of her time. A woman surgeon at that time, goodness, that's incredible.
Way ahead of her time, yes, indeed. As you can imagine, even today, it's something that we have to push actively, and which is why I've always been very much for actively encouraging women in surgery. Interestingly, in India, it's a little known that when I was training as a surgeon, half of the residents were female. And that too is unusual even today in England, and I think perhaps to some extent in the United States and other places too. So yeah.
Well, we're talking about training now, and nowadays junior doctors are almost obsessed by taking the correct direct career path. But I'm fascinated by your career path because it was anything but direct, a fantastic international experience. Take us through that step by step.
Yes, I've been very fortunate, as you say, to have a very interesting path to where I am currently. I was born in Africa, grew up in the UK, went back to India, did my A-levels there, went to medical school there, and then did surgery in India. So I had a real exposure to surgery in India in the 1980s. And then was prompted by a desire to learn more, to broaden my research capabilities and acquire certain other skills. And that's when I came to the UK to further my training, because in those days in India, you couldn't really get a training in hepato-biliary surgery. So I then went through the whole UK training scheme again, effectively, and got my fellowship, and then was fortunate to be selected into a national program for training in liver transplantation and hepato-biliary and pancreatic surgery, which was my chosen area of interest. And having spent a number of years doing research and clinical training in that area, qualified as a consultant in 2005. But I've since had an opportunity to go to the United States in the early 2000s, around 2010, 11, and then subsequently also set up a service in Singapore, re-established a liver and pancreatic surgical service in Singapore. So I have been very, very fortunate to see the entire gamut of surgery on, I think, 3 or 4 different continents in very different settings. And I think that's what's propelled some of my preoccupations with inclusion and equity across the last few years. Yeah.
Let me take you back to those two things because they fascinated me. The ability to take a sabbatical. Now, not many people take a sabbatical. Tell me about that process.
So one of the things that's driven me is I'm reminded of this apocryphal story, perhaps, about Michelangelo on his deathbed at the age of 87, saying "Ancora imparo," which I understand to mean still I am learning. So I feel that part of our fulfillment and purpose in the work that we do comes from continuously learning and being stimulated to do that. And that's what's driven a lot of the different things that I've done. And I think part of that ability to learn afresh is about consciously displacing yourself from a place of comfort, going somewhere new, being stimulated by new ideas, new people, new cultures, new opportunities to learn new ways of doing that. And that applies to both surgery and the context within which that delivery of surgery sits in terms of the healthcare systems and how they work. So I think that's critical. And in terms of training too, I think, although increasingly the tendency is, as you were saying, to pursue a very direct path, and I understand the motivations for that, having had a very rich training and a general surgical base on which I've subsequently developed my specialist training, I think that's been immensely helpful because I'm very privileged in that I've dual accreditation. I've done, if you like, I've done trauma surgery for 20 years, but I'm also unusual in that my specialism is liver and pancreatic and biliary cancer surgery and complex benign work. And I think all of that has now allowed me to also take on robotic surgery. So there's been an opportunity, I think, because of the breadth of my exposure to participate and contribute in more than one field and to learn different skill sets. I think the skill sets that you need as a trauma surgeon are very different from the ones that you need as a hepatobiliary surgeon. One is long hours, intense concentration, precise repairs. The other is about damage control and the right kind of decision making. And I think being privileged to sit in both those spaces has strengthened and reinforced my skill sets in both of those areas. So I see that as a real privilege and a real blessing. And I hope that in this direct pursuit of training that's short and snappy and quick, we don't lose out on some of the richness that you inevitably need to develop surgical insight and wisdom.
Well, part of that richness was your trip to the US where you worked with IHI, which is another remarkable experience. Share that with us.
That was a really privileged year, a blessed year. I had the opportunity, thanks to a Health Foundation fellowship, for which I'm always grateful still, to visit the Institute for Healthcare Improvement and spend time with people like Don Berwick and Maureen Bisignano and others, but also spend some time at the Harvard School of Public Health and the Harvard School of Business and the Kennedy School of Government, because even though I love what I do as a surgeon, I've always been conscious that surgeons have to contribute more in terms of strategic thinking around how that care is delivered and understand the context of their healthcare system and indeed the health of the populations within which that delivery sits. And so for me, I've always been taken by Ron Heifetz's idea that somehow clinicians have to both be able to get on the dance floor and also get up on the balcony and have those two perspectives if they are to be truly able to contribute both in terms of clinical care to patients who need it, but also help shape the care that we deliver in the wider sense. And that was what the year at the IHI really taught me in terms of not only understanding quality improvement methodology and patient safety, but also the clinical leadership that needs to sit around that to help and support that, and to also understand how cost and quality and population health and joy at work, the staff that deliver it, all of these things start to interplay in a way, and increasingly the notions of inclusion and equity interplay in such a way that you provide exceptional care. So that year was, as you say, transformational for me. I met some wonderful people and learned some wonderful things, and it's informed the direction of my subsequent career journey.
Now let's bring you up to date and talk about something else. And you alluded to it there a moment ago, and that is you're co-chair of the Inclusion Board. Tell us about that.
I am, and since I took on that role a year later, I've now been appointed as a group executive director on our trust board to drive both inclusion and equity within the organization to help lead and drive that agenda. And I think it's particularly relevant where I work in East London, which is a deeply underserved area. Socioeconomic deprivation is high. And we have a very diverse population. I think over 140 languages are spoken in East London, for example. But we also have very diverse staff. And the purpose of connecting inclusion directly to equity is to make sure that we have an organization where all our staff feel included, treated fairly, and feel that they belong, but then to connect that sense of belonging directly to their sense of purpose in terms of ensuring that there is equity in terms of the way we deliver healthcare for our patients, but also the communities that we serve and our wider population. And I think this was brought home particularly during COVID and some of the challenges that our local communities faced in terms of accessing care. And I think increasingly we don't do enough when we talk about quality of care and fail to understand just how much issues around inclusion and issues around equity play into our ability as clinicians to deliver care in that richer sense that is of a high quality. And that's something we don't have to solve all of the problems as clinicians, but we certainly need to be aware of how some of these factors play into the way we are actually then able to respond to people's need.
This whole area of fairness and diversity and equity, it's clouded in a lot of jargon, but
Yeah.
I've heard you use simple terms which really came home to me, and that was fairness matters. Tell us how we put that into practice.
Absolutely does to me. And I think for most of us that resonates. It's about fairness. Now, it's hard to tease that apart. I've been deeply influenced by the thinking of John Rawls. And I think we're constantly trying to balance the tension between freedom and fairness. And I think within Rawls's theory of justice, and there are legitimate criticisms we can make of all of this, there is an attempt to balance that tension between respecting and recognizing people's freedoms, but also ensuring fairness in terms of this principle of ensuring that when difference emerges, we do our very best to ensure that those who are least supported or most underserved, if you like, by those differences are also lifted up. When one person progresses, we try to make sure that everyone else does. So I think in that sense, institutions and organizations have a responsibility to look at their structures, their processes, the way they provide care. And where there is disparity that clearly impinges unfairly on the people that they serve, I think we have a responsibility to do everything we can to make sure that we address that unfairness and that we make sure that things work more fairly. So a lot of what we're doing as an organization is an endeavor to look honestly at these issues. The reason I emphasize fairness is I think because there's sometimes when you look at things through the lens of identity, you can get caught up in identity and get distracted from the issues of fairness. And I think while identity matters and must inform the discussion, it should not take over our need to make sure that it's the fairness that sits at front and center in everything we do. So that's been a big preoccupation of mine and my organization for some time now. And we're very much at the foothills of what that means in terms of equity. But I think it's an important principle to keep in mind that fairness matters.
Now let's change tack a little bit, because you're a surgeon. We have our image of what surgeons are like. Even worse, you're a robotic surgeon. We have that image even exaggerated. But there's another side to you that's a bit unexpected, and that's your interest in mindfulness and much more subjective things. Talked about that angle.
Yes, this is my main preoccupation. I've meditated since I was about 21. And perhaps I've meditated because I've needed it more than most. But I'm convinced increasingly as I've gotten older and as I've learned to be more disciplined in the practice, that just learning to be present, and mindfulness techniques vary. There are various ways in which people can do it. And some are just naturally gifted at it. Others, like myself, perhaps not as much. But if you practice diligently and you persevere, mindfulness practices can increase your capacity to be present. And I think as a practicing clinician, as a surgeon, anybody involved in healthcare, the capacity to be present in the moment without judgment is critical to your ability to then respond in a way that's kind and compassionate. And I teach mindfulness techniques to some of the new consultants at their induction, and they find it helpful. And I think it's just a collective way of anchoring ourselves in the present so that we can respond with kindness. The other thing that I think mindfulness practices can do, certainly based on my experience and what I understand of the emerging evidence, is that it softens our sense of self in a way that makes us naturally reach out and respond to others. It also makes us more conscious of our interdependence on one another. And I think it really offers an opportunity for us to recognize issues of fairness. So I have this mantra that I think I've shared with you in terms of saying, I say to myself, just be, so that you can be kind and then be just. And those three phrases are what sort of keep me anchored amidst all of the challenges and constraints and things that we are all facing, I know, across the world. I try to say to myself, always try to just be, so that you can be kind and then be just. Yeah. So I think the mindfulness has been very helpful in getting to a position where I'm able to, I hope, a little bit more consistently talk, but not just talk, walk that walk in terms of my daily practice and in some of the other roles that I do in my organization.
Ajit, thank you very much for sharing so much of your life, your philosophy, and shaking up our understanding of what a surgeon really is. I love that mantra. Just be kind, be just. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. I'm very grateful.